This lecture will cover control statements. It'll cover ifs, the if statement, the switch statement, and loops. We'll go over this material pretty quickly because it's assumed that you've seen these in other programming languages and don't need to spend a lot of time learning them. If you need more time learning them, always look at the textbook and look for other tutorials. So the first control structure we'll talk about is the if statement. I have a basic HTML page here without much content. I've set the title to control structures, and I've added in this headers talking about if statements. To do anything in PHP, we have to enter into PHP mode, so that's where all of our coding goes. And so an if statement looks like most if statements in other languages. We have you type if, and then in parentheses you have a condition, and then you use curly braces to show what we want to have happen if this condition is true. And I'll just print out true, and we can see that since it's true, we get that. And if we change the condition to false, and we'll see that it skips over the echo and true part. Now if we do want something to happen if it, this is to make a choice. If we want something to happen if it's true, then we could put it here, and if we want something to happen when this condition is false, we can put it here. So we can make a choice, and in this case we'll echo out false. So we can see that now it says false because it's false, and we could put true there, and it will say true. So this is the basic if statement. Now usually we don't just hardcode this in. It doesn't make much sense, because why not just echo out true if we put true in here? But we can put variables in here. Variables can store Boolean values, which are true and false values. So we'll create a variable called condition, and we'll set that to true. And we can see that it still says true, and if we set it to false, the condition to false, then it will say false. Now what happens if we misspell this variable right here? Let's just say I added an E in there, or maybe even capitalize this like that. Just a common mistake. If it hasn't seen the variable before, it defaults to false. So if you go if and something that you haven't created yet or haven't assigned a value to it, then it just will default to false. So even though condition is true with a lowercase c, the uppercase condition is undefined, so that defaults as false. Now we can also do comparisons in here. So since we want this to be custom, we'll create a variable called name, and we'll set name to something that we get from the query string. So maybe we'll call this visitor instead. So the visitor will put their name up in the query string. We'll assign that to a variable name, and if the name is equal to Fred, then we can print out welcome Fred. And if not, we'll just say welcome visitor. Okay. And so we see it says welcome visitor. That's because there's nothing in the query string. We can put something up there, visitor equals Fred, and we could see that it now says welcome Fred. And also notice that comparison is case sensitive. So if I did a lowercase Fred, it wouldn't be equal, and it'd say welcome visitor instead. So when it compares strings like that, we need that. Also, if you're coming from Perl, in Perl, when you compared strings, you use the EQ. That doesn't exist in PHP. Whether you're comparing strings or numbers, you always use two equal signs. And we can also, one more thing that we can do with this is, let's say we want a lot of HTML. We want to we want to put tags around this and style it up. So we could put our HTML tags in here, a paragraph tag, maybe, and then a span tags and stuff like that. But remember, we want to try to put as much of the HTML into HTML mode. So we can exit out of PHP mode by putting the question mark greater than sign to get out of the PHP mark right there, and then enter back into PHP mode to do the else, and we can exit out of PHP mode after that curly brace, and then enter back into PHP mode to get the ending bracket right there. So if you noticed, now we can, if you notice, all of the PHP stuff is in PHP mode, so we need the curly brace and the if statement and all of this inside here. The same for the else, and the same for the ending bracket. Now when we're going into and out of PHP mode, some of your indentation could get off a little bit, and it could be hard to indent, but do your best to indent. Indenting means tabbing things over. If you notice, once I have a curly brace, that everything inside of the curly brace has a couple of spaces or a tab in front of it to move it to the right, so that it sticks out. So if we want to try to make this look more normal, we could try to do that. So we have this if statement. Here's the closing curly brace, another opening curly brace, and another closing. And notice that all of the closing ones are on the same start at the same distance over to the right. So now inside of here we can just put some HTML paragraph tag. Paragraph tag right here. Closing paragraph tag right here, and we'll do the same for this one right here. So and as you can see, we can include a lot more than just a paragraph tag. We can have heading tags, we can have full sections of HTML. You can have your entire content of your page in between these two if statements, and you can switch almost the entire content of your page with this. So we'll save this, and we'll see that, do that, and we can view our page source, and we can see the paragraph tags are around that. Now notice welcome visitor didn't show up. The if statement was still able to control the flow, so all of this stuff, since it's inside of the else part of the if statement, doesn't get printed out, even though it's in HTML mode. So that's really helpful. So we can put large blocks of HTML and then still have our if statements control whether they show up or not. We can also use if statements to compare numbers. To do that, I'll get another variable, call it age, and I'll get the age from the query string there, and I'll test if the age is equal to 13, and I'll echo out you are 13, and if not, echo out you are not 13. Okay, so let's see this work. If you notice, I don't have an age variable up here, I just have visitor is equal to Fred. So when I refresh this, it says you are not 13. So what happens is age, since it's undefined, since there's no age variable up here, this is undefined. So this is equal to an undefined value. So when we say is age equal to 13, of course it's not equal to 13, it's undefined. Age defaults to, when a variable is undefined and we're going to compare it to a number, it'll default to 0. So if we see if the age is equal to 0 when they don't include it, we'll say you are 13. That's because we're checking to see if the age is 0. So if we move this back to 13, and then we can say the age is 15, well that's not 13, so it says you are not 13, and we can make this 13, and now it says you are 13. We can also add more conditions, so we could see if they're less than 13, and say you are under 13, else if the age is less than or equal to 15, and it says you are not 15, well we'll change that to say you are under 16. So notice this doesn't include 13, it's just everything less than 13, so that would be 12 and under, so you're under 13. And right here, since this is less than or equal to 15 would be included. And we'll do one more. 18, echo, you are under 18. And then else was echo, you are over 18. Okay, so how this will work is the first condition that it meets, it will do that condition and then it will skip over the rest of it. So what might happen is it might meet two conditions. So if we make this 13, if we put 12 in here, then it's less than 13. Well, it's also less than or equal to 13, but it'll do this one first, and it will print out you are under 13, and then skip over the rest. Even though it still matches this condition, it'll skip over it because it already met one of the conditions. So just remember that it won't fall into both, it'll only do one and then skip over the rest. Also with this else clause is the last default thing, so if it doesn't meet any of the conditions, then we're guaranteed that it will at least fall into this else and print out that. So I'll change this back to 18 and we'll see how this works. So right now the age is 13, so it says you're under 16. Well, if we make ourselves 25, then you're over 18. If we make it, say, 10, then you're under 13. And if we make it, say, 17, you're under 18. So you can see how this works, and hopefully you've seen if statements before. One more thing to show you with if statements is we can combine conditions with ands and ors. So maybe we want a special message for all visitors with the name of Fred that happen to also be 20 years old. So their name has to be Fred and they have to be 20 years old. So we can do an if statement like this. If their name is equal to Fred and their age is equal to 20, then I'm going to get out of PHP mode so I can add some HTML in here. Notice how I have to enter back into PHP mode to put the ending bracket on. And again, indentation is a little bit hard when we're going in and out of PHP mode. We can just try to do your best to make sure it's readable. I usually will just have this thing, since it's all part of the ending if statement, I'll just have that be on the same line as that. And now we can go H3, Fred, age 20 is our special visitor. And then we'll end that right there. So we'll refresh. Now if Jerry shows up and Jerry's 20 years old, well, that's not Fred being 20 years old, it has to be Fred. And when we have Fred, then we get our Fred, age 20, is our special visitor because it's Fred and age 20. But if a 25-year-old Fred shows up, then it doesn't do that. So our conditions can combine. You can combine this. Now we can also say or. So this is and right here. Or is two lines. So it's shift and then the backslash, which is usually above or around the enter key, but you have to press shift to get it and get those two bars. And that means or, so they could be Fred or they could be 20. And so this guy's Fred. He's not 20, but he is Fred, so he's our special visitor. Of course, he's not age 20. Now we can see if Jerry, age 20, shows up. And it says Fred, age 20, is our special visitor, even though his name is Jerry. It's just printing out this message that I have right there. And that's all I'll cover for if statements. They're the basic building block for most programs, so it is important that you understand them. If you need more practice or help with them, search on the web for more programming practice with if statements, but I'm assuming you've already seen this in another programming language. Now one statement that goes along with if statements is called the conditional statement. And you might or might not have seen this in another language, but most languages have them. The conditional statement is like an if statement all in one line. Let's say that I have a variable here called visitor type. And if the visitor is say age 20, then I want the visitor type to be an adult. If they're under age 20, then I want them to be a child. So how can I do that? Well, what I normally would do is I'd go if the age is greater than or equal to 20, then I will set the visitor type to adult, else I'll set the visitor type to a child. Okay, so this is on quite a lot of well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code to do this. Well, a conditional statement allows you to do this in one line, so I could do all of this in one line by doing this. We just put two parentheses down and our condition inside of it. So if our age is greater than or equal to 20, then you use a colon for the true part, or you put a question mark, sorry, for the true part, and a colon for the false. So this right here does the exact same thing as this right here. So this is called a conditional statement. I'll get rid of this now, and I'll just echo out, put a line break here to make sure it's on its own line. Visitor type is, and then print out the visitor type. So let's go ahead and see what happens with this. So the visitor type is an adult right here. That's because they're age 20, but if they're say 15 years old, then the visitor type is a child. And so this is an if statement all in one line. You can do it on the right hand side of a equal sign. So if you want to set a variable to two different things on some condition, you can do that all in one line. Another thing that we can do is we can just print it out right here. So what we'll print out will depend on the age. If the age is 20 or over, we'll print out an adult. If not, we'll print out a child. And so we'll see this right here. If I save, and I missed a semicolon, and so now we see that it said child right there, and that's because they're age 15. If we do age 22, then we can see it says adult. So you can use this on echo statements. It's a very useful thing to do a quick little if statement if you need it. And just some tips as you program, some things that will help you keep some errors out. There will be one more video that I'll do that will help you debug, but just some tips so you don't have to debug. If you've noticed, every time I created an if statement, when I put the opening bracket, I put an ending bracket. And that goes the same with my PHP tags. When I entered into PHP mode, I automatically put my ending PHP block in there. And the same for HTML tags. When you put an opening HTML tag, always put the ending one in. So the order that I did it in is I did my if statement, I put the open bracket, then the closing bracket, and then I went in between and put in what I wanted to do. So I made sure I completed my if statement before I thought about what I want to do in between. If you don't do that, what will happen is you'll put all of this right here, and then you'll try to think about what you want to put in between, and then it's very common to forget to put the ending bracket. The same goes for entering into and out of PHP mode. The other thing is proper indentation. Indentation, again, is how far you tab or put spaces over between here, and just try to keep it really clean so you can read it. What you need to do is when you open a curly brace, everything inside is tabbed over, and then when you close it, you tab it back so that you see this separation in here, and you can clearly see where this if statement begins and where it ends, because they're the same distance from this part over here. That'll help you a lot. Anytime you go to get help in this class, I'm going to make sure that you have proper indentation. Usually when people have an error and their stuff isn't indented right, I tell them to indent properly, and then I'll look at their error, and they never ask me what the error is because they figured out that they were missing an ending bracket. So those are just some suggestions to prevent some errors. So now we'll talk about case statements, but to talk about case statements, first I have made this if statement that checks the name of our visitor, and if the name of the visitor is Fred, it will welcome Fred, and also Jerry, George, Mary, and if it doesn't recognize the visitor, then it will welcome a guest. So just to show you that we do assign name to be the query string variable visitors. So up in the URL, if you say visitor equals something, that's what gets assigned to name. So we have this if statement here, and if we look at it right now, I have visitor equal to George, so it will say welcome George, and we can also try Mary, and it'll say welcome Mary. Now we don't enter into and exit out of PHP mode, but we can do that if we want to include more HTML, and so we could do something like this, where we exit out of PHP mode to start including HTML. But another way to do this same thing, and maybe a little bit easier, is to turn this into a switch statement. So to make this into a switch statement, I'll just snap my fingers and we'll have this switch into a switch statement. Alright, so now we have a switch statement. It does the exact same thing as the if statement that it just replaced. It could be a little more condensed right here. So now we can see that it says switch, and this is the name of the variable that we want to check, and these are the different values we want to check for. So if the name is Fred, then we'll print out Fred. If it's Jerry, then print out Jerry, and so on. So let's see how this works. We have a visitor, Mary, and if you notice it says welcome Mary, but it also says welcome guest. Let's try maybe putting in Fred, and now notice it says welcome Fred, Jerry, George, Mary, and guest. So what happens is this case statement tests the value of the variable, and if it's equal to that value, then it starts executing everything after that. So when it matched Fred's case, then it welcomed Fred, Jerry, George, Mary, and guest. Well, for Mary, it was just welcome Mary and the guest. And if you notice this default case at the end, it doesn't have anything. This is, if it hasn't matched anything before, then it will jump into right here. But what if we don't want to welcome Jerry, George, Mary, and guest when we welcome Fred? Well, we do that with a break statement. And a break statement will exit you out of the switch statement, and then you'll start executing code right here. So we can quickly insert these break statements throughout our exercise here. And we could put a break statement down here, but it doesn't really do anything because the next thing we do is we just jump down right here. So these break statements right here will now fix our problem. So now we'll just welcome Fred. And now it welcomes Mary. So this is what a switch statement looks like, and you can also enter into and out of HTML mode. So I'll snap my fingers one more time, and we'll to have this enter into PHP mode and exit out of PHP mode, so maybe we can add more content. So now we can see that this is the same switch statement, except for we exit out of PHP mode here and enter into HTML mode, so we can put a bunch of HTML here. I know I'm only putting a little bit, but you can put a lot more. And then we enter back into PHP mode to include the break. And if you notice the indentation right here, I indented this up one thing so I can tell that this case statement goes until here. And then this case statement is at the same indentation level as that one. And then we have Jerry's and then a break. We go back into PHP mode, break. Now George, we exit out, we do George's HTML, back into the PHP mode. So this is how a switch statement would look if we enter into and out of PHP mode. It does the same thing as before, so we still get welcome Mary, and we can try George, and I'll say welcome George. So that is a basic switch statement. Okay, now we'll talk about loops, and the first loop we'll talk about is a while loop, and hopefully you've seen these before, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. But if I want to print out something a certain amount of times, I'll just get something from the query string to tell me how many times we want to do it. And so I'll create a variable I, and I'll set it equal to 0, and that will be our loop counter. I could go while I is less than the number of times we want to go through the loop. So let's say they say 5 times. We'll go through this loop for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We won't go through it for 5, but it will still be 5 times because we went through it for 0. So that's how it looks, and then we'll just echo out something. We'll put a line break at the beginning to make sure that it's on its own line. We'll say this is the $ith time through the loop. Okay. And if I were to run this right now, I might crash this recording, so I'm not going to run it. And that's because I will always stay as 0. We need to increment I, so the next time we go through this loop, that I will be 1, and then increment it again, so it goes to 2, 3, 4. If you accidentally create an infinite loop, it's probably okay. The server will time out, but since I'm recording this, I don't know how it will react when I do it, but try not to do it, but you won't create create a huge problem. It's just tie up the server for a few seconds. And so now we can see this, and we don't see any loops. That's because we don't have times up here. So we'll add in another variable with an ampersand, times equals 5. And then we could see it went through the 0th, 1, 2, 3, 4th time through the loop. And we can also try 10, and it will go through 10 times. So that's a basic while loop. And as you know, a while loop is useful, but there is a for loop that sometimes you can replace while loops with a for loop. You can't replace all while loops. Sometimes you're not incrementing something. One instance of this is you might want to print out all the records in a database. So that's while there's another record in the database, let's print this record out onto the PHP page. You can't replace those with for loops, but this loop can get replaced with a for loop. So I'll snap my fingers and replace this with a for loop. Okay, so I left the while loop in here so that we can kind of compare the two, but here's the for loop that does the exact same thing. It's just tied the things associated with how many times you want to go through the loop all onto one line. So we know that we want to start at 0, we want to increment 1 at the end of each loop, and we want to keep going until I is greater than or equal to times. So while I is less than times, it will keep going. So it's just basically taking this piece, and this piece right here, and putting them all onto the same line. So that's the difference between a while loop and a for loop. Okay, and one thing that I'll show using nested loops is I'll show you how you can use nested loops to kind of create a table on your page. So I'll snap my fingers and have this automatically appear. So this is the table that a table that I've added in. As you can tell, I get 2 more variables from the query string, how many rows and how many columns we want. We exit out of PHP mode and into HTML mode, so I can put some HTML in. So I start a table and I end a table, and then here I have nested for loops. So this outside for loop is in charge of making a row, and notice we start at row 1 and we keep going until it's equal to that. So instead of starting at 0 and going to 1 less than the number of rows, we'll start at 1 and go to the number of rows we want. And so this will print out each row. This for loop will print out each cell within the row. And inside of each cell, we should see the column that we're at and then the row that we're at. So let's see this for loop in action. I'll save this, refresh. There is no table because I don't have any rows or columns in the query string, so they default to 0 rows and 0 columns. So if I want 6 rows and 7 columns, and I look down here and I have my table right here. The table doesn't have any borders, so we can't see it, but if we view our page source, we can see that we have the tables right here, and it's kind of a long thing, but here's the beginning table, and then we have a table row, and at the end we have the ending table tag. So that's nested for loops, and it's also a variable, so the user can put up here how many rows and columns he has. So if he only wants 3 rows and 2 columns, he can change it and make the table that he wants right there.